Hello, everybody. Happy Veterans Day. The military men and women who serve and protect the U.S. come from all walks of life. They are parents, children, grandparents, friends, neighbors, and coworkers, are an important part of our communities. Here's some interesting facts about the veteran population of the United States. 21 million Americans are veterans. 18.2 million living veterans served during at least one war as of 2018. 9% of veterans are women. 7 million veterans served during the Vietnam War. 3 million veterans have served in support of the war on terrorism. Of the 16 million Americans who served during World War II, about 496,000 were still alive as of 2018. Connecticut was home to the highest percentage of World War II veterans as of 2018 at 7.1%. 2 million veterans served during the Korean War. As of 2017, the top 3 states with the highest percentage of veterans were Alaska, Maine, and Montana, respectively. I saw this poem a few years ago and wanted to share it today as we honor our veterans. It is the veteran. It is the veteran, not the preacher, who has given us freedom of religion. It is the veteran, not the reporter, who gives us the freedom of press. It is the veteran, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It is the veteran, not the campus organizer, who has given us freedom to assemble. It is the veteran, not the lawyer, who has given us freedom of the right to a fair trial. It is the veteran, not the politician, who has given us the right to vote. Today on Veterans Day, we honor those who honored our country with its highest form of service. You who once wore the uniform of our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Coast Guard, we owe you our thanks. We owe you our respect, and we owe you our freedom. We come together to express our profound gratitude for the sacrifices and contributions you and your family made on the battlefield, at home, and at outposts around the world. But America's gratitude to our veterans is something always grounded in something greater than what you did on duty. It's also an appreciation of the example that you continue to set after your service has ended, your example as a citizen. Veterans Day often follows a hard-fought political campaign, no different this year, an exercise in the free speech and self-government that you fought for. It often lays bare disagreements across our nation, but the American instinct has never been to find isolation in opposite corners. It is to find strength in our common creed, to forge unity from our great diversity, to sustain that strength and unity even when it is hard. And when the election is over, as we search for ways to come together, to reconnect with one another with the principles that are more enduring than transitory politics, some of our best examples are the men and women we salute on Veterans Day. It's the example of a military that meets every mission, one united team, all looking out for one another, all getting each other's backs. It's the example of the single most diverse institution in our country, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, who represent every corner of our country, every shade of humanity, immigrant and native born, Christian, Muslim, Jew, and non-believer alike, all forged in common service. It's the example of veterans, patriots, who when they take off their fatigues, put back on the camouflage of everyday life in America and become our business partners and bosses, our teachers and our coaches, our first responders, city council members, community leaders, role models, all still serving this country we love with the same sense of duty and with valor. Our veterans are still the first to help, still the first to serve. Whenever the world makes you cynical, whenever you seek truth, humility, and true selflessness, look to a veteran. Whenever the world makes you cynical, whenever you doubt that courage and goodness and selflessness is possible, stop and look to a veteran. They don't always go around telling stories of their heroism, so it's up to us to ask and to listen, to tell those stories for them, and to live in our own lives the values for which they were prepared to give theirs. Together, we must continue to keep the sacred trust with our veterans and honor their good work with our own, knowing that our mission is never done. On Veterans Day, we acknowledge humbly that we can never serve our veterans in quite the same way that they served us, but we can try. We can practice kindness, we can pay it forward, we can volunteer, we can serve, we can respect one another, we can always get each other's backs. That is what Veterans Day asks all of us to think about. The person you pass as you walk down the street or the hall might not be wearing our nation's uniform today, but consider for a moment that a year or a decade or a generation ago, he or she might have been one of our fellow citizens who was willing to lay down their life for strangers like us. We can show how much we love our country by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Happy Veterans Day to all the veterans, and thank you for your service. May God bless all who served and still do, and may God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you. Have a great day.
A few moments ago, I placed a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And as I stepped back and stood during the moment of silence that followed, I said a small prayer. And it occurred to me that each of my predecessors has had a similar moment, and I wondered if our prayers weren't very much the same, if not identical. We celebrate Veterans Day on the anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. The armistice that began on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And I wonder, in fact, if all Americans' prayers aren't the same as those I mentioned a moment ago. For all we can ever do for our heroes is remember them and remember what they did, and memories are transmitted through words. We see these soldiers in our mind as old and wise. We see them as something like the founding fathers, grave and gray-haired. But most of them were boys when they died, and they gave up two lives, the one they were living and the one they would have lived. When they died, they gave up their chance to be husbands and fathers and grandfathers. They gave up their chance to be revered old men. They gave up everything for our country, for us. And all we can do is remember. There's always someone who is remembering for us. No matter what time of year it is or what time of day, there are always people who come to this cemetery, leave a flag or a flower or a little rock on a headstone. And they stop and bow their heads and communicate what they wished to communicate. I think sometimes of General Matthew Ridgway, who the night before D-Day tossed sleepless on his cot and talked to the Lord and listened for the promise that God made to Joshua. I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. We are surrounded today by the dead of our wars. We owe them a debt we can never repay. All we can do is remember them and what they did and why they had to be brave for us. All we can do is try to see that other young men never have to join them. Today, as never before, we must pledge to remember the things that will continue the peace. Today, as never before, we must pray for God's help in broadening and deepening the peace we enjoy. Let us pray for freedom and justice and a more stable world. And let us make a compact today with the dead, a promise in the words for which General Ridgway listened: I will not fail thee nor forsake thee.
Okay, so we're all veterans here, and I'm sure we're all happy to be veterans, and that means you've been doing something for a long time.
Well, the best description I can give you of Veterans Day is through the years, they have been taking veterans to Washington from all over the country in World War II, and now they're further along on the other wars. And it's fascinating how people react in the airport, on the Veterans Day. They will say something about thank you for your service, and it's very touching of how they react as individuals. During the war, I was on this particular ship that I have a picture of, and at the beginning, when I went in the first of January of 1944, I was put on a ship called the Roy, which was not the one I have the picture of. And we went down to past the equator, all the way down to a French island in the South Pacific to unload our airplanes and our fuel. And we were at one end of this docking area, and all of a sudden, there's an explosion, and there was a munition ship that was there in the harbor to provide missiles and things to the different ships. It exploded, and we were way away from it, but we heard the noise. And it turns out that after the war, I found out that one of my friends that I was in college with at the University of Texas was on that ship. And of course, that was my first experience as far as being in a combat area. We then went back to San Diego, and I picked up the ship that I have the picture of called the Shenango. The Shenango was a oil ship, and they converted it from that into an aircraft carrier, and they made 4 of these oil ships into aircraft carriers. And so these 4 ships worked together throughout the Pacific, in fact, until the end of World War II. And my ship had been in 13 battles through the war. I only joined it after about 7 battles. And it started in North Africa and went all the way up, to Japan. And then I stayed on it as we went through the Panama Canal to Boston Navy Yard, where I was discharged. And there were 3 or 4 instances which were extremely interesting. One day I was sitting on a deck below the main deck of the aircraft, and a mine was moving in the opposite direction that my ship was on. And you sit there, you don't know what's going to happen. It can come up, hit your ship and explode, or it can go on past. Well, it went past, and I'm thinking, my life is there and may not be there an hour from now. But fortunately, the mine just went on past the ship, and then it was exploded by a destroyer. That was my first experience. The next most important experience is after the bomb was on Nagasaki. There was a prisoner of war camp about 10 miles from the epicenter, and my ship was charged with going over there and picking up the prisoners of war and that they were releasing, the Japanese were releasing. And of course, the situation was, since we were in dock, they said, would anybody like to go ashore? The bomb had actually hit 15 days before we got there. They put us on these trucks, and we rode around Nagasaki. Think about what was there. I mean, there was nothing there but radiation, but nobody even thought about the radiation. The next experience, and of course we picked up all these prisoner of war and took them to the Philippines, but there were it's a very interesting sidelight to it in that the people that were picked up were mainly Dutch people who were made prisoner of war by the Japanese. In addition to those people, there were the natives that were picked up. And once the natives were freed and the other people were put on board the ship, the natives wanted to take the other people apart. I mean, they were so upset with the foreigners that were running their country up until Japan. So we had to set up armed guards between them till we got them to the Philippines. That was my second interesting. And the last interesting thing, after the war had actually ended and we were getting ready to move back to the United States, a hurricane came up and we ended up going into the main island, and there was a peninsula there, so our ship can go in there because we couldn't outrun it. So they asked, does anybody want to go ashore? So being inquisitive, I said, I do. So another shipmate and I went ashore. The war had just ended, literally, and we walked up this hill and nobody looked at us. In fact, they turned away. They were so, I mean, it was like the Japanese as fighters were the most vicious in the world. But once the war were over, they were very docile. They didn't look at us, and if they did, they kind of put their head down and walked away. So then we went back, of course, to the ship, and from there we went to Tokyo Harbor, which was interesting to be able to go. But in other words, the war had ended on the 15th, and by the time we were there, and it was signed and sealed. So MacArthur was already put in place to run Japan. So we were allowed to walk anywhere we wanted, and so we walked around Tokyo, and again, nobody would say anything to us. So those were my most memorable experiences.
My term of service in the Navy started in 1944, and that was quite an experience for me to move from the sunny South up to the Midwest in November of that year to a really cold time, and had the experience of going to boot camp at Great Lakes, and was assigned to the Naval Training School for electronics technicians. And that was something I was really looking forward to, and I learned a lot of things, not only about the Navy, but about modern techniques and modern technology, and things that I was able to use later on in my life and career. We learned a lot of things in that school. We learned things that were supposedly very new and cutting edge and very secret, and we were not supposed to talk about them outside. We also got to see some of the illustrations that they showed us of how the equipment that we were learning to troubleshoot, how that would work. Unfortunately, I did not finish the school by the time the war was over, and the Navy dropped a lot of us out. But I look back on that a lot. I remember a lot of the things that I learned. To this day, when I read about something that happens in the war or some new piece of equipment, I begin to think about it, and I remember something that I picked up then. And I still, in a way, regret I didn't have more time to learn those things, but a lot of it stayed with me. And I do like to go back and interpret what I see today in light of what I picked up back in those years.
Well, I feel kind of like Greg. It's been so dadgum long trying to remember dates. But I was very, very fortunate. I was never involved in any combat. And my Navy duty was primarily during the Korean conflict. And I had already graduated from medical school and postgraduate training, and I was assigned to a troop ship as a medical officer. And it was interesting, that was in 1949. A Korean conflict was underway, and very interestingly, the Navy really didn't care what kind of specialty you are. My fellow medical officer was also a pediatrician, and we looked after 3,000 troops on board, going from San Francisco to Incheon, usually to Incheon, Korea. And when we got to Korea, it was one of the most strangest things I've ever seen. We sailed in every time into Incheon. There were lights on day and night, and you could hear artillery rumbling in the distance because it was reasonably close to the 36th parallel, as I remember. And that was as close to combat. But one of my memorable, I guess if you have a memorable occasion, was on one of our returns to San Francisco. We got radio message from a transport ship that the chief engineer was quite ill, and they needed a doctor to come and look at him. So we were in the mid-Pacific, and it was in some pretty heavy weather at that time. And I was a junior officer, so I got to go, and they put me in a lifeboat with a wonderful crew, and we made it over and went up on board, and I checked this guy, and it was obvious he had probably an acute appendicitis. He had what I would call peritonitis, and we were able to move him off into our lifeboat and move back to our ship, and we got him finally safely into San Francisco in about 3 or 4 more days. Of course, we filled him with antibiotics and fluids, kept him going, but we had finally learned that he did live, and that made me very, very happy. The caring for people have asked me, when you spent that time, and what did you learn while you were in the Navy? Well, I'm an expert on mal de mer. Can you imagine 3,000 young men, who most of them had never been out on a ship at all, and we had some really dehydrated kids. And I learned how to take care of mal de mer. And then on the way back, guess what I learned? It's called STD, sexually transmitted diseases. So I became an authority there. So that's about some of my highlights, I guess. I'm just so proud that I was briefly in World War II. Right after I had finished my pre-med, I was transferred to Corpus Christi Naval Air Station for about 5 months. And then I was called back in during the Korea. So I'm so proud to have been a veteran and be with these guys.
Knew that I was going to get killed, but I didn't. I got back to my foxhole, and then I guess we had a few days over. I only had about half of the men left with me, and I didn't know where they went. But nobody told me about Boots. Well, maybe they were gone. Anyway, he said go. So I started down there the same way, and all hell broke loose. I thought the sergeant was crazy. Anyway, it was worse than the first one, and I went back to my foxhole. I just got back, the same sort of way. And all quiet for a couple of days. And then all of a sudden, I'm then on Foxhole. There's another guy with me this time. And I looked up, and here come a Japanese in a plane, one of those planes that take suicide in. He came over towards me, and I started like this, and I'm looking at him, and I ran over in this empty Foxhole over here, and then he turned around, and he went behind me and over where the company was, and he exploded. That Foxhole just shivered and shook, and he killed 14 people back in the back. And so I'm left out there this time by myself, and I asked, I was thinking, and I was looking up, and here come the same damn stupid sergeant, and he says, "The captain wants you to go reinforce our troops." And so I went over there. I got to the hill that I was supposed to go over, I guess, first. And I climbed up there, got about, 10 feet from the top. It's a pretty big hill. And boy, they let go. And I covered my head. I'm in space, free space. I covered my head with my rifle. And one of the mortars hit right here, cut my rifle in half, and another one hit back here and kicked me in the back. And of course, I bleeding like a stuffed hog. So I didn't know what to do. I crawled backwards down the hill and got almost down to the bottom. And here come two medics. And boy, was I glad to see them. I had these bleeding all over. And they picked me up, and I was like this on the stretcher. So they went down to the regiment headquarters, and there was no room in the regiment headquarters. Then they went to division headquarters, no room in division. Then went to the Army, no room there. And then they says, "Oh, we'll go take him over to this hospital ship in the bay there." And they went over there, no room there. And so they took me down to the airport and says, "You better take this guy." And all the time I'm like this. And he said, "You better take this guy someplace." And they said, "Oh yeah, we got room for one more on this plane to Tinian." And by this way, at this time, I'm a wreck, I think. Anyway, what cooled me off quite a bit. There were 7 other guys in this C3 or something like that, Greg. And anyway, got back to this hospital, and they spent the next day taking iron out of my back, and I felt that the war was over for me.
Well, I served in Korea, so I went in somewhat later than the other veterans here. I was on a cruiser, and rather than talk about the combat, I'd like to tell one story about what happened. But before I get to that, Cliff, you may have been a pediatrician on ships, but we had a doctor who was worse off than you. He was a gynecologist, and he treated mostly STD on our ship. But the event that I want to describe kind of capsulizes how excitement can be concentrated in just an instantaneous moment. On our ship, there were 2 of us, 2 cruisers coming back from Korea to Long Beach, California, and the officers decided that we ought to practice towing. So they decided to use our anchor chain, and an anchor chain has links that are big around as my leg, and a long strip of anchor chain weighs tons upon tons. So they strung the anchor chain between our ship and the other cruiser, and they were towing us for a while. And I was up on the bridge. I was a white hat, enlisted man up on the bridge watching, and that was my post. And I was looking down, and at the end of the towing exercise, they decided that we had to pull that chain back on our ship. And that meant that that chain had to be pulled back through what's called a hawser hole on the front of the ship, and it had to be pulled back and attached to what's called a capstan, which is a gear that pulls the chain back onto the ship. So in order to get it back on our ship and pulled up on the deck and attached for that ratchet to pull it back aboard, they had to attach a hawser line, and a hawser is a rope. We call it a rope about that big around, and they attached this to the anchor chain while it was still stretched between the two ships, and that hawser line was stretched from the front of our ship to all the way back to the length of the ship to the rear end, and all of the hands were called on deck. Everybody was told to take a hold of this line because they were going to pull this chain back onto our ship. I was watching all of this from up there, and everything was being arranged, and there was one man up in front, and I couldn't tell what he was doing. He was standing right at the hole where the hawser line went out and was attached to the anchor chain. He had an axe in his hand. And he stood there and was looking down at that rope, never took his eye off that hawser line, standing there with that axe. So the word came out that they were going to release the chain from the other ship, and everybody was told, take a grip on the line. And here's this line of hundreds of sailors lined up, holding this line. And then the order came, drop the chain from the other ship. And when that dropped, that hawser line went tight, and all of those sailors were being dragged toward the front of the ship, and that sailor with the axe made one chop that instantly, like that, cut that line, and all the sailors that hadn't fallen forward were pulling on that line. They all fell backwards. I looked down there, and every sailor on that deck down there was lying on the deck. And to this day, that anchor chain is lying somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But that was something to see, how orderly that was done and how they were prepared for that event, that fellow standing up there, that second class boatswain's mate standing up there with that axe knew exactly what he had to do, and he did it. Anyway, excitement can happen very quickly on a ship. Thank you.